Let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a genuinely epic story. We're looking at a legendary figure whose larger-than-life deeds literally laid the groundwork for the ancient cradle of Greek democracy. We're talking about Theseus, the great, semi-mythical, semi-historical king of Athens. We're going to unpack the incredible source material that paints him not just as your standard monster-slaying hero, but as a deeply complex leader whose triumphs and tragedies shaped an entire empire.
How did a monster-slaying demigod give birth to democracy and then lose everything? We're skipping a traditional agenda today because honestly, that one question is all we need to guide us. How exactly does a man go from smashing bandits and slaying half-beast monsters to forging a sophisticated, peaceful, centrally administered state? And perhaps more importantly, how does someone so powerful eventually lose it all? It's a fascinating, deeply tragic, mythological journey. So let's start right at the very beginning.
Section 1. Two Fathers, One Destiny.
Every great hero's journey starts with their origins, right? And Theseus has a backstory that is frankly uniquely bizarre even by mythological standards. It all begins in the region of Troezen. Theseus basically came into the world with a dual nature. First you have King Aegean of Athens. He was absolutely desperate for an heir, so he secretly married Princess Aethra. But on her wedding night, Aethra took a fateful moonlight walk through the shallow waters to the island of Spheria, and that is where she met Poseidon, the god of the sea and earthquakes. Because of this moonlit encounter, Aethra was doubly impregnated, meaning Theseus was born blessed with both the royal, mortal lineage of an Athenian king and the unstoppable, divine strength of an Olympian god. Before Aegean left for Athens, he hid his sword and sandals under a massive rock, leaving strict instructions that his son should only come to him when he was strong enough to lift it.
Section 2. The Road to Athens. Growing up, Theseus was deeply ambitious. He really wanted to emulate the legendary Hercules. So, unsurprisingly, when the time came, he easily tossed that massive rock aside and retrieved his father's sword and sandals. But when he was advised to take the safe sea route to Athens, he flat out refused. He wanted a challenge. He chose the treacherous, robber-infested land route around the Saronic Gulf. He deliberately turned his journey into a brutal gauntlet just to prove himself. It became this legendary road trip of leveling up. At Epidaurus, he encounters Prithious, who bashed travelers' brains in with an iron club. Theseus simply took the club and dashed the villain's brains out instead. At the Isthmus, he meets Cyriolis, who tied victims to bent pine trees to literally catapult them to their deaths. Theseus gave him the exact same flying lesson. Near Megara, Sciron forced travelers to wash his feet on a cliff's edge, just so he could kick them down to a sea monster. Theseus turned the tables, and Sciron became the monster's lunch. You see the pattern here? He relentlessly leveled up by defeating each brutal bandit using their own twisted methods.
And that leads us perfectly to his final roadside challenge in Eleusis, the giant Procrustes, known as the Stretcher. Now, Procrustes was a charming host who offered travelers a bed. But if they were too short, he stretched their limbs until they fit. If they were too tall, he chopped off their legs. Theseus, staying true to his theme, gave the Stretcher a fatal taste of his own medicine, making him expire in his own short bed. What's really fascinating here is how this ancient lore lives on as a concept we still use today. A Procrustean bed describes a situation where someone forces arbitrary compliance to a rigid standard.
Section 3. Slaying the Minotaur.
Theseus finally makes it to Athens, but he doesn't immediately reveal his identity to King Aegean. And honestly, it's a good thing, because the king was under the control of the evil sorceress Medea. Medea recognized Theseus immediately through her occult powers and tried to have him killed by sending him to capture the dreadful Marathonian bull. Theseus, being bored without a challenge, captured the bull easily. As a quick aside, during this little side quest, he actually took shelter with a kind old woman named Hecale, and when she died, he honored her by naming a region after her. That name survives today as Ecale, a modern luxurious area north of Athens. Returning victorious, Medea tried to poison him at a feast, but Aegean finally recognized the sword and sandals just in the nick of time, knocked the poison away, and banished Medea. But Athens was hiding a dark, gruesome secret, represented by a stark number, 14. This is the brutal tribute demanded by King Minos of Crete to avenge a past war. Every 9 years, Athens had to send 7 noble boys and 7 noble maidens, 14 innocent youths in total, to be cast into the inescapable labyrinth and devoured by the terrifying Minotaur, a half-man, half-beast. Against his father's wishes, Theseus volunteered as one of the tributes, promising that if he survived, his returning ship would fly white sails instead of the mournful black ones.
Now, this is where the myth gets incredibly complex.
The love affair with Ariadne. Truth or trick? When he arrived in Crete, King Minos's daughter Ariadne fell madly in love with him. She gave him the two things he desperately needed to survive: a sharp sword to kill the beast, and a skein of thread to retrace his steps out of the maze. Theseus succeeds. He slays the monster, follows the thread out, and escapes with Ariadne. But the source material leaves us with a burning question. Did he actually love her, or was it just a trick? One version says the wine god Dionysus demanded Ariadne for himself in a dream, forcing a heartbroken Theseus to leave her on the island of Naxos. But another, perhaps more credible version considering his character, suggests Theseus merely pretended to love her to get her help, completely abandoning her the moment she was no longer useful.
Well, whether out of heartbreak or the curses of an abandoned princess, the result was a catastrophic oversight. They forgot to change the black sails to white. Back in Athens, King Aegean stood on the cliffs of Cape Sunion every single evening, anxiously watching the horizon. When he finally saw his son's ship returning with black sails, he assumed Theseus had been ripped apart by the Minotaur. In utter, unimaginable despair, the king threw himself off the cliff into the water below. And this brilliantly illustrates the origin of a major geographical name. To this day, it is called the Aegean Sea, in memory of the beloved tragic king.
Section 4. The Golden Age.
With Aegeus dead, the monster slayer becomes the king of Athens. But instead of resting on his laurels, Theseus dramatically pivots from mythological action hero to an incredibly wise and far-sighted statesman. He profoundly transformed society. He peacefully unified scattered, disparate Attic communities into one powerful, centrally administrated state. He championed agriculture and leveraged the sea for maritime commerce, realizing the ocean would be Athens' greatest source of power. He instituted the Isthmian Games and the Pantheia festivals to foster cultural unity. The ancient Athenians viewed his earlier exploits, smashing monstrous villains, as an allegorical representation of how Theseus destroyed tyrants, freed citizens from fear, and ended foreign tributes. These civic achievements quite literally paved the way for the very birth of democracy.
Section 5. A Hero's Tragic Fall.
But listen, this is a Greek tragedy, and nobody escapes their own hubris. Even a demigod who built a golden age can be completely undone by impulsive, reckless decisions. And for Theseus, the mistakes start piling up rapidly. It begins with the Amazon War. On a voyage, Theseus meets Antigone, a beautiful emissary from the legendary female warriors, the Amazons. What does the great king do? He entirely forgets diplomacy and simply abducts her back to Athens to make her his queen. The outraged Amazons launch a massive, brutal invasion that penetrates deep into Athenian territory. While Theseus eventually repels them, the cost is devastating. Antigone, who actually fought alongside him against her own people, is killed on the battlefield.
Yet he just didn't learn his lesson. After forming an inseparable, intensely loyal friendship with Prithious, a friend he famously helped fight off drunken centaurs with at a wedding, by the way, the duo hatched a deeply disturbing scheme. They decided to each abduct a daughter of Zeus. Theseus chose a girl from Sparta named Helen, the one who would later become Helen of Troy. She was only 9 years old. While this is ancient mythology, we really can't gloss over this. It is a horrifying, unacceptable crime. He abducted a child, intending to hold her captive until she was of age. Rightfully so, Helen's furious brothers, Castor and Pollux, immediately invaded to rescue her from this horrific abuse.
But the ultimate tragedy struck from within his own family. Theseus married his second wife, Phaedra, who was actually the sister of Ariadne. You remember, the woman he had abandoned years ago on an island. Well, in an act of divine revenge, the goddess Aphrodite cursed Phaedra to fall madly in love with her own stepson, Hippolytus, who is Theseus's son from his first marriage to the Amazon. When Hippolytus scornfully rejected Phaedra, she committed suicide, leaving behind a note falsely accusing Hippolytus of raping her. Blinded by rage, Theseus used a divine boon from his father Poseidon to curse his son. Poseidon sent a sea monster that terrified Hippolytus's horses, crashing his chariot. Theseus learned the truth from a servant just in time to hold his innocent son as he died. It is a staggering tragedy. A mortal father mistakenly wielding divine power to accidentally murder his own boy.
The final steps of this epic life fall like dominoes. Step 1. The tragic death of his son and his past actions finally catch up to him. He faces widespread rebellion and entirely loses public favor in Athens. Step 2. The man who unified the state is forced to abdicate his throne and flee in absolute disgrace to the island of Skyros. And finally, Step 3. The unceremonious, pathetic end. The local king of Skyros, Lycomedes, fears Theseus might try to usurp him, so under the guise of friendship, he invites the great hero to the top of a cliff and simply pushes him off into the sea. The great monster slayer, murdered by a cowardly push, forgotten by the very state he unified.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. How does a man who defeated every monster in his path end up entirely undone by his own human flaws? It's a profound reminder from the source material that the ancient Greeks didn't view their heroes as perfect deities. They saw them as wildly capable, but deeply fatally human. Theseus gave Athens its unity, its commerce, and the seeds of its democracy, but he couldn't conquer his own impulsivity and hubris. It leaves us wondering, what is the greater threat to a legacy? The monsters lurking in the labyrinth, or the flaws hiding within ourselves? Think about that, and keep exploring.